And of course the addendums to Vellum 101 came quicker than anticipated, with the first question being how can I loop a simulation? And in theory it's pretty straightforward, and it gets even easier when we look at our simulation in the style of a layer-based timeline, for example, a video editor. This is my animation/simulation ranging from frame 1 to frame 200, just this bar. And to make it loop, what we do is we cut this thing in half, just duplicate it, so we have 2 layers now, one ranging from frame 1 to frame 99, and one from frame 100 to frame 200. Next we will offset our pieces of a simulation, so that the frame at the beginning and the frame at the end are adjacent. And also, as you can see, we overlapped our pieces, and this is the area where we will blend in between the animation or the simulation state. And finally, if we look at the offset in Houdini frames, this is what it looks like. So a bit counterintuitive, and that's why I drew it out. So the piece of animation that is offset to the front will have a value added to its frame counter, while the animation offset to the back will have a value subtracted from its frame counter. So let's build a quick example here in Houdini by dropping down a grid first. Diving in there, setting its orientation to the XY plane, and scaling it to, say, 0.7 by 0.4 units, with 20 rows and 35 columns, just a low-res grid, consisting out of square quads here. Let's drop down a vellum cloth, to configure this as a piece of cloth, and also I'd like to pin this side of the grid, so we have kind of a flag look. So in between goes a group, highlight that, and call this group pin, set its type to points, and we'll use the bounding regions just to group the single row of points here into the pin group. Let's middle mouse on this, and yes, we've got 20 points in the pin group. So in our vellum cloth here, let's set the pin points group to pin, can be permanent, that's fine, and then let's drop down a vellum solver. Highlight this, and in here on the forces tab I will disable gravity, dive inside my solver, and drop down a pop wind, so that I can give this a bit of turbulence. So I'll set this up to blow in the X direction by setting its initial vector to -3, and then also increasing the noise attribute, that's the turbulence. So let's head up one level, highlight the vellum solver, maybe save this, check the real-time toggle, and simulate this. And that's kind of your standard cloth behavior. You could tweak the settings of this in the vellum cloth here, but let's roll with it for now. Alright, let's offset this simulation by using a time shift. Shell wire in the vellum. And in our frame expression here, I want to offset this to the beginning, so shift it in this direction, by adding 100 to it. Let's click on this and we can see it now starts at 101 and ends at frame 340, and also it simulated those additional 100 frames that we didn't simulate yet to fill this whole thing here. Let's duplicate our time shift and offset this part of the animation to the back by subtracting from it minus 140 frames, like this. So when we click on this, we can see in the end it's frame 100. So that's basically one frame off from where we are at the beginning here in this time shift node. So this animation is expected to loop from here to the last frame. And all we need to do now is blend between those animations, somewhere in between. And let's decide where we do that. So let's just also ghost the time shift 2 here. And we can see there's not much happening because this frame range is still in the negative. So there's nothing happening there. And we can see it gets positive here at around frame 141. So we want to give this a bit of pre-run so the simulation isn't stiff in the beginning. And maybe we want to blend here in between frame 180 and say frame 200. And to do that, I'll drop down a blend, that is a sequence blend, and wire in those two time shift nodes. And all the sequence blend does is, with the help of a single float, it blends between those two inputs, between input 0 and input 1. So let's animate that between frame 180, set its value to 0, alt-click in here to set a keyframe, and maybe go to, say, frame 210, set this one to 1, keyframe it again, and then let's save this and run our animation. So that is now running seamlessly. And this is the easy method of doing that. And it's what I'd most likely do in production because it is straightforward, it's quick, and it's very controllable. Basically all you have to do is set your time offset in those two nodes here, and then animate the blend in here. However, with more complex simulation, we can run into some issues here. So let's talk about this. Again, I'll set up a grid. Dive in there, set this to the XY plane. Let's set the size to 4 by 0.8 and increase our rows and columns to 40 and 200 respectively. So we'll end up with square quads in here again. Let's also offset the center to -2 so we have this first row sitting at 0 along the x-axis, and then again drop down a group and use this to create a pin group, which will set to points, and we again will use the bounding regions to group those first points here in our grid, like so. And what I want to do here is have kind of a flag swirling around in a circle. So I'll use a transform, which I'm going to restrict only to the pin group, move up the transform's pivot point to, say, 0.7, and then animate the rotation along the z-axis by dropping in a quick expression, let's say $FF -1, so that we're starting at 0 in the first frame, times, say, 3.6, so it takes 100 frames for a full rotation. Let's just play this, and this is looking a bit weird, admittedly, but it's doing what we want for now, just pulling this first line of points. Next I'll drop down my vellum cloth. Gonna pin the points in my pin group, want to set my pin type to soft, and match the animation. Let's just check the other settings in here, and I want to set my bend stiffness to a lower value of 0.025. Now let's drop down a vellum solver, and again in here I want to set my gravity to 0, and in my main tab I want to have 2 substeps with 64 constraint iterations. Also, I will dive in here, and again add some pop wind, just to give this a bit of more turbulence. And I'll dive in the amplitude here to 1.4 and the swirl size to 0.5, and to this add a bit of drag like this, which I'll leave at its default settings. Alright, let's save this, keep our fingers crossed, and simulate it. And we can now see we are getting this clothy, floaty, swirly behavior. Alright, let's try looping this. And for that I want to simulate this a bit further, so give this whole thing 300 frames here. Again, simulate it through, and then drop down our 2 time shifts. Wire up the first one, and in this case I want to offset this by 50 frames, but I also want to make sure that my values stay in the range of 1 to 300, so I don't simulate additional frames. I can do that with a clamp expression, so I'll be clamping this value here between 1 and 300, like this. Let's just copy this time shift over here, and in this case I want to offset it by minus 149 frames, like so. Yeah, that is working. Alright, let's use the sequence blend here, wire in our 2 time shifts, and in this case I ran a few tests and I want to animate this in between 196 from 0 to 250 to 1. Like so. And when I highlight this now, let's just play this. And you can see this is jumping a bit at the end here. So let's have a look at this. So my second time shift, the one I'm blending to, at the end has a value of 151 frames. So let's find the point in time where the first time shift here has a value of 152. So, like this. It's frame 102, so let's start this animation from frame 102 and loop this again. We can see now that is working so far, and when I only highlight the blend node here, you can much clearer see how this is looping. However, what you can also witness when we are blending in here is those areas where we're seeing penetrations. That is because we're blending linearly between those 2 positions without taking into account that the cloth might be colliding in between. And I've been discussing this with Simon Fiedler, a dear friend of mine, who also often has to loop simulations. And basically we came to the conclusion that what you typically do in production is just look for another point in time where you blend to avoid these kind of intersections here. However, if you have to fix it, there is a way. It's just not the quickest way. And that is through a second vellum solver. So to prepare my geo for another second post-sim simulation, I will delete all attributes that might have been set due to my previous vellum sim. So I'll just delete anything that's on the points, vertices, primitives, and detail. And do the same thing for the groups. So when I highlight this, middle mouse on it, I see I have no attributes and no additional groups in here. Speaking of groups, I want my second post-sim, vellum sim, to follow this animation here widely. So I will just create a pin group again, this time just containing all points. instead of just a single row. Call this one pin, set it to points, and in here just do the star. So I'll have everything in here in the pin group. 8,000 points, that's fine. Next, I'll correct for my stupid mistake here. So I'm starting my animation at frame 102, but for my simulation it would be nice to have this whole thing start at 0. And yes, I could correct this up in here in those 3 nodes, but in reality, the quick and dirty way that will give nightmares to the guy taking over this setup is to use another time shift. In this case, just offsetting this by 101 frames. So again, when I go to frame 1, I'm starting with the first frame of my looping animation here. And it will run to 199 frames. So again, let's just check. Yeah, frame range is set up properly. Now let's pipe this into a vellum cloth. And let's just set up its parameters here. So in this case, I'm going to use the cloth just as kind of a combination of springs that will pull my initial animation to the simulation, and use the simulation just to solve the penetrations. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of this clothy behavior and just have kind of a gooey mass that pulls together. So I will increase the normal drag to 100 and the tangent drag to 10. Pin our whole animation using soft constraints, and I want to match the animation here. And through a bit of trial and error, I dialed down the stiffness just to 1/10 of the original setting. Increase the damping ratio a bit. Decrease the bend stiffness to a really low value of 0.0025. And that's about it. As always, a bit of trial and error to come up with those numbers. Lots of test sims, lots of tweaking, but that's where I ended up. Let's attach to this a vellum solver. And again, let's go through the settings here. I want to use 2 substeps at 100 iterations. And also I want to increase my collision and polish passes to 40. And these are the main settings responsible for dialing in the look of that constraining solver here. Especially the polish paths can smooth out some jaggies that we might get here. And in the forces I want to disable gravity and also check off wind. And let's save this and just try running it. Let's stop this here, and as you can see, this clearly did not work as expected, so we're still getting those interpenetrations. So there's a bit of further tweaking needed. Let me just do that and I'll be back after I changed a few settings in here. And although I dialed in something slightly more successful in here by, on the one hand, adjusting the stretch stiffness in the vellum cloth, and then in the vellum solver increasing my constraint iterations while decreasing my collision passes, all of this is a bit frustrating, because what's happening here is I, in theory, have to tweak 2 different settings. The one being the stretch in between those different points of the cloth, and the other one, the stiffness with which the pin constraints are enforced. So how strong those strings that are pulling the whole cloth to the animation are. And by default, there's no way of doing this, because I can output my pin constraints into a separate group. So let's highlight our vellum cloth and maybe attach a null to this, wire this into our constraints here and highlight this. So let's head over to the geo spreadsheet in here and click on the primitives. That's where my constraints live. And when I click on this match to animation here, I can see that there are a few primitives that have this attribute set to 1. However, when I go back to my vellum cloth and disable the pin to animation here, and then again have a look at my resulting constraints here, this match to animation is gone. So basically, what the vellum cloth constraint is doing, as soon as we're checking match to animation, it's writing out this attribute match to animation to those constraints that are responsible for pulling our cloth to the pinned animation. So we can use that to drive their stiffness individually by creating a group out of this attribute, and thus grouping our pin constraints that are there solely to pin the cloth to the animation into a separate group, and then being able to adjust them while we're simulating. Let's use a group expression to do that. Wire in our constraint geo in here. Let's call our group pincon for pin constraints. It'll be primitives, and we want to have everything in here which has the attribute match animation bigger than 0. Middle mouse on this, and we've got now 8,000 constraints grouped in here. Let's wire that in our vellum solver, and in the vellum solver, let's use a vellum constraint property, which we will constrain to our pincon group to drive its stiffness here. And not only can we set the stiffness separately in here, but we can also animate this while simulating. So what we maybe want to do is, while we are blending, have the stiffness of these constraints a bit lower, say 10, keyframe this. So after I keyframe this here, let's maybe animate this down a bit so that while we are blending, we are getting a looser attachment to the animation to give the cloth a chance to slide and thus resolve penetrations. So keyframe this here at 96 at a low value so I can give the cloth a bit of a chance to slide away from its original position and thus resolve the intersections. Let's start the animation maybe at frame 72, and let's start with a higher value such as 1000 so the cloth really stays attached to its original animation. Let's keyframe our low stiffness at 160 again, and let's animate it up to say 185 to 1000 again, so we stay with the animation. Okay, let's get up one level, reset this, save this, and let's resimulate. Okay, we immediately get those jaggies here. And for that, in my vellum cloth, I want to increase the stretch stiffness, so the stiffness of those individual points in the cloth, say 100,000. So we can now see that fixed most of our issues. I mean, there's a bit of jagginess in between here when you look closely, but in this case I would be pragmatic and not dial in my simulation any further, but instead use the vellum post process to smooth out the simulation a bit and also to subdivide it. So a bit more involved this time, the setup, but it gets rid of most of the interpenetrations and usually results in decent looping animations. Just to point out the important steps here, just my basic simulation setup here, then offsetting the individual parts of the simulation, blending between them, and then deleting all the attributes that have been created in the simulation, putting the whole first simulation in a pin group, time shifting it so it starts at the first frame, and then using the vellum cloth together with the vellum solver to remove interpenetrations while we're blending between the two states of a simulation. And here it's important to notice that we separated our pin to animation constraints with this little expression in a group expression node to be able to, in the vellum solver, use the vellum constraint property sub set to the group that we just created to dial in the pin constraints stiffness, independent of our cloth stiffness here. And then in the vellum solver, the main settings that we're dealing is substeps constraint iterations and also the polish passes to get rid of some jaggies. And that's about it. So all individual parts are not that complicated, but as often in production setups or with production setups, when you hook them up together, they tend to look more complicated than they really are. Alright, hope you're having fun with this one. As always, looking forward to seeing what you guys produce using this technique. And until next time, it's cheers and goodbye.